Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the final week of Imagining America's collective creative engagement, where artists, scholars, and organizers have been engaged in a month of reimagining and a call to action leading up to the presidential election. We are almost there. My name is Erica Cole-Arenas. I am the faculty director of Imagining America, and I'm also faculty here at the University of California, Davis in American Studies. So this week, this final Monday plenary, we take up the question of activist and public scholarship and higher education itself. It is really my honor to introduce today's conversation with radical scholars who are exploring just transitions. And I invite all of you who are connecting online with us right now to introduce yourselves via the chat. We welcome you to use the chat as our event forum, have conversations with one another, ask questions for our panelists. You can also use the questions function and ask your questions there, and we'll save time towards the end of this session to engage with you. My colleague Mina is on the back end there helping us collect those questions to address towards the end of the session today. Okay, so let's get started. It's my honor to introduce you to today's panelists. Joining with us today is Barbara Ransby. Dr. Barbara Ransby is the John D. MacArthur Chair and Distinguished Professor in the Departments of African American Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she directs a campus-wide social justice initiative, a project that promotes connections between academics and community organizers doing work on social justice. Dr. Ransby is a historian, author, and longtime activist. She's been involved in the Black freedom movement, feminist struggles, and social and economic justice projects for nearly 40 years. She's also a longtime friend of Imagining America and has served on our National Advisory Board. So welcome, Barbara. It's such an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Erica.
We also have today with us Stacey Sutton. Stacey Sutton is an associate professor in urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and is the faculty liaison in the Social Justice Initiative. Her scholarly interests lie at the intersection of race, place, and self-determination, principally focused on worker-owned cooperatives and economic democracy, Black geographies, liberated zones, and solidarity economy initiatives, and racially disparate impacts of place-based policies. I'm really quite excited to learn more about your work, and she's also currently working on a multi-city study of solidarity economy ecosystems and the potentiality for radical alternatives in the United States. As a scholar and activist, Dr. Sutton partners with various grassroots and community organizations committed to racial and economic justice, economic development, anti-gentrification, displacement, and cooperative ownership. And I'm really excited to learn more about your work, as well as more about the social justice initiative that you and Dr. Ransby are both engaged with. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And last but not least, we are so honored to have with us Margo Okazawa-Rey, Professor Emerita of San Francisco State University, who's an activist and educator working on issues of militarism, armed conflict, and violence against women examined intersectionally. She has long-standing activist commitments in South Korea and Palestine, working closely with Do Ray Bang, My Sister's Place, and Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling, respectively. She's a founding member of the Combahee River Collective, a 1970s anti-imperialist, socialist African-American feminist group that introduced and promoted an understanding of intersectionality informed by Black feminists who came before. Professor Okazawa-Rey is one of the founders of the International Women's Network Against Militarism and serves on the International Advisory Board of Do Ray Bang in South Korea, as well as the International Board of Peace Women across the globe. She's also, I hear, transitioning off, but has been on the board of the Highlander Center, which is an organization also dear to my heart. And we almost met Margo at a fundraiser my family organized when Highlander faced that awful white supremacist fire of their buildings pre-pandemic summer ago. But you were in Palestine, of course, as an international activist scholar, you would be. So I miss meeting you there. We joke we are now Zoom friends. So welcome, Margo. So great to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you.
So I'm going to take a moment now to introduce the week-long conversation about activist scholarship in higher education and kick off the first question here today. But for those of you joining us online and participating, we designed today's conversation really as a dialogue amongst these three activist, public engaged scholars. And so I do have some questions in my pocket, but I'll mostly be stepping back and really welcoming a robust conversation here amongst you. And I know you three all have many projects you're working on, and I look forward to your questions for one another as well. But let me kick off our conversation briefly. So when Imagining America moved to our campus at UC Davis 3 years ago, my first cover to our newsletter was about the white supremacist protests in Charlottesville. And we all knew that with an almost 20-year organization, we had to dig into a really deep rethinking about our mission, our vision, and our values, and what is most critical to lift and organize around today. So one of the things we're really committed to is a new set of values that we've developed for Imagining America. And one of the values, actually the first one we list on our website and organize our work around, is that we believe it is important to struggle with the idea of America. So as now written alongside 6 other we believe statements, we write, the idea of America embodies both a prophetic vision and legacy of social movements that have fought for a fully equitable, broad-based popular democracy, and a troubling history of violence, oppression, and genocide. To realize our vision, we believe that it's important to struggle with this contradiction and how it has continued to manifest domestically, regionally, and globally. And so over the past month, we're now in our final week, Imagining America has engaged in a collective creative engagement with speakers, artists, community organizers, designers, this morning graduate students, online participants like yourselves who've zoomed in today, to struggle with and reimagine aspects of life in America that we're struggling with today, from planning to housing to land and liberation. This week, we turn to the question of public, activist, and engaged scholarship, mobilized within, across, and beyond institutions of higher education, locally, regionally, and globally. So as we begin, I recognize that questions of taking on higher education in this particular moment from the perspective of the movement activist are not brand new. Many of you may have, I know some of our speakers here have presented at, but I've participated in conversations launched and lifted by the Scholars for Social Justice. There are many online conversations worth revisiting, through the Hacking the University conference that Jack Chen hosted at Rutgers University a week ago, with many important conversations there. One that I actually attended in person in what I now call before times last February at the University of California, Los Angeles, through the Institute for Inequality and Democracy, really taking on the financial structures and the debt structures of higher education. Of course, the COPS off-campus organizing and the scholars strike that some of you here participated in, initiated by Althea Butler. So I know this isn't a brand new question. So I ask us to think about what this means for you as we're 1 week away from the elections. Also in the context of many people now using the word reimagining. I've seen it pop up in corporate advertising. I know it's also been used in many ways to prop austerity measures during the pandemic, further cementing corporate restructuring and some capitalist logics we've seen for many years in higher education, as Ruthie Gilmore recently called higher ed's move to have capitalism save capitalism from capitalism, as she often says of these kinds of moves. My former colleague Jas Dillon at the New School wrote brilliantly about the New School hiring corporate consulting firms to kind of do just this. And so, as many have called and used Arundhati Roy's comments about the pandemic as a portal and a gateway between one world and the next, and that we can choose, and I quote her here, to walk through this portal, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice, our hatred, our avarice, and databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world. I turn now to you three, as activist scholars who have each radically reorganized traditional academic relationships and norms, worked alongside movements and communities, to reflect upon this particular moment of both crisis and opportunity, to share what you think is most essential today in reimagining and reorganizing higher education, And also importantly, what are the most critical roles for activist scholars to take on today? And with this, I turn the table over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that, Erica. You might need to manage us a little bit, just in terms of, just this one, this one, this one. Thank you for organizing this forum, and I'm super honored to be in conversation with my dear friend Margo Okazawa-Rey and my colleague and comrade Stacey Sutton. So, that's a big question. What do we think are the challenges for scholar activists and activist scholars? I think you said activist scholar. It's usually framed as scholar activist, like putting the scholar first, but I'm glad, I like that reversal. And, it speaks to, a lot of the work that I've been involved in with lots of other people, around fighting against the notion that the university has a monopoly on knowledge production, knowing that reservoirs of knowledge exist beyond our campuses. In fact, the sort of liberated zones of thinking and theorizing beyond campus, with people who have in mind changing the world and not just describing and defining it and analyzing it. Those are some of the most vibrant intellectual spaces I've ever been in, and often with people without academic credentials. So I think getting over ourselves, those of us who live in the academy, is part of the challenge. Challenging the notion of meritocracy is another part of the challenge. Like, universities give cover to inequality by making it seem somehow fair. If you get a 30 on a standardized test as opposed to a 31, that can be a life and death decision in terms of you getting into a university, getting a degree, getting credentials. And so, ways in which the notion of meritocracy pollutes and gives cover, pollutes certain democratic learning processes and gives cover to inequalities and to racism, quite frankly, is something I think we need to confront. And then, of course, you alluded to in your overview, universities, colleges and universities have become increasingly corporate, embracing neoliberal models, assuming everything is, is a commodity, and if it doesn't sell to our clients, and it just gives me chills to think of that language referring to our students, but the students are treated as customers and clients. We're selling them a product that they can then resell on the market in the form of credentials. I mean, that is really a kind of a perverse way of viewing education and the kind of knowledge acquisition that we all need in order to live in and build a better world. So I think all of those are things we need to confront. We'll maybe talk a little bit later about some concrete efforts at U of Chicago, at UCLA and elsewhere. Places have also been doing work around the question of reparations. But I guess the final thing I'll just say, indicting universities also as patriarchal institutions, as institutions that have historically promoted masculinist notions of teaching and learning and power, and have required a certain kind of conformity in order for us to get legitimized within them. The notion of diversity at most universities is that we provide cosmetic, diversity, and in every other way we conform to the way the university has always functioned, which is highly problematic, to say the least. So, all of that is a part of what's on our plate when we talk about challenging the corporate university.
Yeah. I think I'll pick it up from there, Barbara. It's interesting because one of the things that comes to mind when I think about that is, what would it mean, as a question, I guess, it's kind of, what would it mean to democratize the university even more? I think there's a way in which we think that universities and the governance structures are democratized. But if I think about it through the lens of kind of the cooperatives and economic democracy, it seems to me that that is a perfect space. The universities could be a perfect space to kind of fully embody these democratic processes, and the way in which we can fully kind of own our labor, because we actually have this within the university. We have the skills and capacities to do so as we run departments, and centers, we could indeed run the university. There are a set of caveats and a set of things that I know a bunch of folks might not want to take on, but I think as kind of a testing ground for such a notion, I think the university would be a wonderful space to really engage that. But in terms of what we do, in terms of the way I think about it with regard to my students, though, I work in urban planning and policy, which is a professional degree, right? And so resisting the tendency, the push toward the neoliberal institution, and the tendency, this professionalization of everything, right? And the tendency to focus on the technical skills as opposed to the critical thinking skills, as if the critical thinking isn't really indeed a skill. I think we, all of us, but especially those who are working in any of the professional programs, really need to resist that, and for me to cultivate and to learn with and teach kind of the intrepid urban planner is to really push them to adopt like these, anti-imperialist perspectives on what it means to kind of build the cities we want to live in, right? That are not just driven by market tendencies, that are not just about growth by any means necessary, that are not willing to trade off efficiency for equity, right? Those are fundamental questions that get at our values as an institution. They get at the values of the profession as well. And I guess I'll turn it over to Margo.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for everything and for the two of you opening this up. I was thinking as I was listening to you that the question is a both and, has a both and kind of perspective, right? And by that I mean, I'll start with us first, right? The both and with us is that we are living with contradictions, because if you think about it, we three, among others like us, we are examples of how the system works, right? And so here we are pushing up against that very thing, and we're also used to show that, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and then you're going to get to be like those three. Not that you want to be like us three in some ways, unless you want to be anyway. So that's one thing to really think about, and how we've been also shaped by our various engagements, and in some ways our success within the academic institution. I think there's a question that's, even before all of that, which is, what is the overall purpose of higher education and of universities? And not just in the US, you can go, to the first university in Timbuktu, right? They've always been about, educating the elite to step into, certain power positions, right? And then things got a little, quote, nicer, and they, then these other educational institutions were created. Nonetheless, even though it's multi-layered, I think it ultimately is about maintaining the status quo. That's one part of the both and. The other part of it, though, is that there always have been, not always, but I would say, institutional domination is not airtight. It's not monolithic. And within the spaces of contradiction, people like us kind of step into them and have ways to create spaces, freer spaces where we can do the various kinds of work and various kinds of studies. But those spaces were thinking about, recent history, recent, I mean 60s, were created by social and political movements, right? That demanded universities be relevant. And I'm just talking, for example, the history of Black studies and women's studies, which started in the same year in 1969 in California, right? And it's interesting, going back to Barbara's point about patriarchal institutions, we remember, the history of Black studies, 1969, but we forget about the formation of women and women's studies, it was called then, the same year, right? And so, how do we in the academy, and now I'm out of the academy because I retired last May, how do we need to think about the kinds of spaces that need to be kept open, right? And Stacey, you talked about the professionalization. Professionalization isn't just in the professional disciplines, right? But it's in all the disciplines, especially the ones who've been on the margins. We have to become more academic than the, conventional academics. So we're living with these contradictions. What I want to underscore, though, is that there really are and can be free spaces, right, in the institutions, and all three of us, I think, have demonstrated that. But I'm not hopeful that we're going to transform the institution. No, I think we have to just get what the institution is and work our way through it, and hope that we're not misshapen by being inside. And we do that in the ways that you two and I have done it, which is to always be connected to movements outside,
Right, yeah.
right? Who hold our feet and hold us accountable and literally keep us grounded in realities that you can, move away from in the academy.
Yeah. No, that's so true, Margo. I mean, I always keep in my mind a kind of outsider inside strategy, right? And think about this from Ella Baker's point of view, who worked in all of these sexist, male-dominated civil rights organizations, and she kind of kept her eyes on the prize, to be cliche. I mean, she fought against the sexist treatment that she received in the organizations. She fought against the elitism in some of those organizations, but she held, she held community with folks outside, right? So I think that is, that's real, we are on assignment. And so remembering to whom one is loyal, the other thing about Ella Baker, she asked this question, who are your people?
Yes.
So your people are not necessarily the people that pay that signed your paycheck. Your people are the people that send you to do more than, be a professional. So I think that's all of what we carry with us in trying to do this work in difficult times, and in times when it's more important than ever.
And in that sense, what I think, what I hear you saying is that the question of who are our touchstones, right? Who tell us what's real, right? And to whom are we accountable ultimately?
Right.
And who should we be accountable to?
Yeah.
If I could ask a question on this that then pivots, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, Stacey, too. This morning on our graduate student panel, they already reflected at a really early career stage what you're talking about, and said, ultimately, given how we're treated in some of these academic spaces, we have to remember who we're accountable to, who we're working for, and the communities that we want to stay in alliance with and working with over the long haul. But at the same time, they struggled with the relationships inside that are really threatening to push them out, just toxic relationships with advisors, dissertation committees that don't understand their sense of accountability to communities. So I wonder if you could also touch on this balance between building these long haul alliances with movements and communities you feel committed to, but also the caring work I know that is a lot of labor and time to students on the inside who also aim to do movement and activist work over the long haul. How do you balance that, and how do you understand that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it has to do with like in terms of who we're bringing into the institutions, right? And how we're supporting each other, right, within those spaces. So surely we have students that are doing work that I can imagine some colleagues would not see as kind of scholarly, but understanding that the questions that they're asking and the people for whom they are kind of working and most accountable are as important, if not more important, than the conventional the focus within any institution. And so personally, what I tend to do is I tend to gravitate toward those students. I tend to try to understand and embrace and support those students a bit more, because there are plenty of other faculty that can work with the conventional scholarly students. So there's that. But I think going back to something that perhaps Margo said in terms of the institution, And it's not that I am not cynical. I do believe that the institution is what it is, or that it's not easily changed. But I have to believe that there is a way in which we can transition the institution, which is kind of emblematic of our larger kind of capitalist system, right? If I believe that there is space for a just transition outside of the institution, I also believe that those of us in the institution can also push back and force it to change in different ways. It might not be as ambitious as I suggest in terms of us taking over the institution and creating it into a cooperative university, but I do think there are spaces in which we can enter and programs and departments that we begin in that really emphasize the bringing in community and pushing out the work we do back to community, right? That dialectical relationship, I think, is really important. Not all departments value that. So the degree to which we hold that up as important, right? We're then pushing the boundaries of this really narrowly construed understanding of what Barbara said, of knowledge and knowledge production. So, I mean, that may not seem like a lot, but I actually do think it's a lot. I think it's a way in which we are both being true to ourselves and to our community and opening up those doors for more community to enter and to bring our knowledge, our capacities, our resources back to community in a very intentional and radical way, right? Using what we have to actually allow community to fight these institutions. I think, and balancing that is always a bit tenuous, but I think that's the part of the important work that we're trying to do.
I wonder if, and I know.
Hold on one second, Barbara, did you want to respond to this?
I mean, well, I'm trying to be disciplined on the thing. I think a lot about, and part of the project Stacey and I are involved in is this question of the Portal Project, right? So borrowing from that Arundhati Roy quote that Erica alluded to at the beginning, what does it mean to engage in transformative change, right? And so I'm not sure if it's transforming the institution or undoing the institution and rebuilding something in its place. I mean, the abolitionist model, talk about abolishing police and prisons and building alternative forms of safety and justice, right? And I think those things have to happen in tandem, because you don't want that, people talk about this period, this notion that, it's not my term, but, the notion of interregnum, when something old has fallen by the wayside or been destroyed, but there is not yet something new to replace it. I was in a meeting earlier today with some movement activists from other countries, and people talked about places like Egypt or even Venezuela, where there was an attempt at a different kind of social order, but it was not sustainable. So I'm very interested in that, the intricate process of undoing and doing, abolishing and building, and I'm not sure how we name it in terms of, to Stacey's point, we're doing the work of transformation. Is any remnants of the existing university system and academy going to be recognizable once it is transformed? I'm not sure. Now that sounds like a tall order, but we're in a critical crisis moment, and we haven't talked about enough that bigger picture, of any number of the current crises that are disrupting our lives would have been a watershed moment, but to have all of them present, from the largest protest movement in history to the COVID pandemic to the crisis of capitalism, really, as it comes up against the environment and financialization and other things. So we are seeing possibilities that we didn't see before, and I think rethinking education has to be on the agenda. And I'm not sure whether what we now recognize as the academy will look anything like its current self if we do our work. So
Oh, I want to start with what you all said, and I think you know, for me, it isn't a question of, you know, transforming the institution per se. I think for me, the question is, what are the values that whatever we create, as we know as higher education, what should be the foundational values of that institution, right? What should it be? What should be the main purposes of institutions of higher education? And I'll just put that in quotes because I don't know we've even been calling it that, right? But I'm thinking about values and purpose, and how would that help us shape pedagogy, curriculum, relationship to community, you know, all of that. So that's something. And do we actually have a vision of that? And should, as educators, should one of our tasks be to create some kind of vision about that? The second thing is related to that is, you know, what kind of persons also, what kind of academics, what kinds of educators, what kinds of institutional beings would we have to become to be in that place so we don't end up recreating the whole thing, you know, just us doing it, right? And so I'm talking about what's the relationship between an institutional transformative project and our own kind of individual transformative project as well. And what's the relationship between the two? Can we do the work simultaneously so that after we create this new place, and then we find ourselves and we're doing some of the same old things, right? And thinking, oh my goodness, how did we get here? And the third point, and this, Erica, goes back to how you started this question. You said, you know, you've heard some of the younger folk, younger academics saying, well, we're treated badly, you know, and, you know, we need to make connections with community. I don't think that's the reason we make connections with community. You know, we make connections with the community isn't our safety bag, right? We make connections with communities because we love them. We are part of them, right? That our destinies are bound up together, not that they're the safety nets for us, right? And so I just want to, and I don't know if that's what even you meant, but I've heard people say that, right? And so I just want to be clear, and this goes to this question of, even as academics, what does our life purpose have to do with the work we do, right? And what does our life work have to do with a particular occupation we're engaged in?
Yeah, I mean,
I want to hear Barbara's answer to that, but for clarification, the students were talking about being committed to communities often from which they come, and knowing that their commitments are to communities who are struggling, that they're long haul throughout their lives, often communities of their own. And their question is, how do we survive these institutions to do the scholarship we believe in? So it wasn't community as refuge, but much more akin to what you were describing, Margo. Sorry, Barbara, thank you.
yeah, I mean, you know, the students working with you may not have said that, but a lot of young academics do have this idea of community as refuge, right? And it's a careerist strategy sometimes. It's like, I'm gonna find my people so I get my letters, so I get my, you know, and I do think it comes back, and I think Stacey first introduced this notion of professionalism. I mean, somehow we're so, you know, my father and mother had jobs. They didn't have careers, they had jobs, right?
Right.
And they understood that who they were as people were separate from their jobs.
Right.
Part of the ways in which professionalization pollutes our notion of centeredness, commitment, identity, values, etc., is that our jobs become, you know, our careers become our identity. And so people who don't share anything with us except, you know, they've read some of the same books, right, are validating or invalidating us, you know, promoting us or not promoting us. You know, in the real world, you know, you have trouble on a job, you have a racist boss, you get fired, you find another job, you organize a union, you file a grievance, you know, you navigate that as a part of being who you are in the world. And I think part of the ways in which professionalization gets us off track is that we believe that we are our jobs, we are our
Mhm.
careers, we are a sociologist or a historian or this or that, as opposed to a person who does that work in order to do other work in the world for which you will never get paid.
Mhm.
And I think once we recognize that, it liberates us to do other things. And I know I'm saying that from the point of view of a senior person who's tenured and all that. But you know what? I mean, I had that view before tenure
Me
too.
too.
And I think
Right.
many of us did.
Yes.
Right.
You don't get tenure. It's not like
Like the end
die.
of the world,
You
right?
do something else.
Right.
Most people don't have tenure.
Right.
Most people don't even know what tenure is. My parents could not understand why I was in school so long. And I was like, can you just get a job, girl? But, so this sort of artificial carrot that's dangled out there of tenure and certain kinds of security, we are now seeing tenured professors losing their jobs,
Mhm.
due to the elimination of departments, due to political persecution, et cetera. So it is not that panacea that we were promised, and it's certainly not worth selling your soul for.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Here, thank you, Barbara. That's really important.
Yep.
And as someone that's kind of relatively newly tenured, I can say that along the way, I held that, right? That it wouldn't be important to me to have job security, which that's all that it is, if I sold out my community. If I wasn't doing the work in community, with community, my community, then it really wouldn't be, there's nothing secure in that, because every day I go home, every day I engage. And if I didn't do that with the highest integrity, then for me, it wouldn't be useful. But I can't speak for others. But I do think there is that, I mean, and this is, I think, what we're trying to really kind of think deeply about through the Social Justice Initiative and the Portal Project, right? Because it's how do you create those spaces that nurture both those who happen to be within the university at this point and really asking some of the big questions, and realizing that we can get some of those answers by asking each other, but a lot of that comes from outside of the institution as well, right? And how do we bring them in? As much as we try to demystify the institution and break down some of the walls, where we still need to do a better job of that. And there's still this kind of allure in terms of bringing people in. And I think part of that is creating those spaces, which I think SGI is trying to do through kind of a fellows program where you can bring people in who have been organizing for years, and they're credentialed in their organizing. They want to spend some time kind of thinking deeply in the classroom, right? Once they get in the classroom, they realize they don't want to be in the classroom. It's not there. But nevertheless, they apply for that kind of program in that space and that time. But there's also, for those who may be more senior, not want to go through another program, how do you create space for this, this knowledge sharing, right? If that means weekly meetings, if it means monthly seminars, whatever it is, we know that we don't have all of the answers. And we surely are learning with our kind of people in the community. We all have different positions. So I think the degree to which more institutes within kind of these formal institutions are creating spaces whereby it's mutually beneficial, right? It's not just extractive. And that's really critical, because often you create those spaces and like bring community in so we can study, this as subjects. But no, it has to be a mutually beneficial, not just a beneficial kind of product, but a vision. We're buying into a vision for change. And we can't do that change within the institution by itself. We have to do the change with community, because they have the same change vision. So we're kind of working on behalf of that, advancing that change. I think we're going to talk more about what that looks like, the concrete elements of that. But I think more and more institutions that really say they're about social justice have to create those spaces. You can't just theorize social justice.
And, related to that, I'm thinking, Stacey and Barbara, that maybe it isn't bringing in, but going out, right?
Fair enough, it is.
And
Both ends.
it's absolutely both and. And I was thinking, what if, for example, a tenure process or the whole kind of hiring and promotion process included something like where we would have to go out and do internships, as part of the process. And while we're out, then we, we can have a community person teaching our courses, for example, right? Do you know what I mean? Where that's a different kind of inside outside.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so how do we imagine, or where are we going to meet is the question, right? Where is the inside and where is the outside?
Yeah. Well, one of the things we've done here is co-teach courses with community members in summer schools, and so that our students begin to see that we see as our intellectual peers, people who are practitioners, people who have not been processed and credentialed in the academy, but have brilliance and a lot to share and great authority. So but also as you're talking about that, I'm thinking back to Erica's original question about what are the challenges we face. And, there's this whole realm of education, and speaking of inside outside, of inside carceral institutions. So, many of us here have taught in Stateville Prison, which is a prison in, outside of Chicago, an Illinois maximum security prison, through something called the Prison Neighborhood Arts Program. And I'm always struck by, one, how serious my students are there, but, how we, is a whole generation of young people who should be in classrooms. I mean, ideally liberated classrooms, we don't have those, but in some kind of classroom, sharing their knowledge and stories, asking their questions, having space to learn and think and grow and debate and all that. And, many, many, many of them are incarcerated. And so even folks, those of us who aspire to an abolitionist vision realize that going inside and crossing that boundary between those of us who are ostensibly free and those of us who are, unequivocally unfree, that crossing that boundary is a critical one in terms of, really navigating and thinking about and assessing the world that we live in, and garnering knowledge from some of the most marginal members of our communities, marginalized. You have some other questions up your sleeve, Erica?
Well, I would love, perhaps if Barbara, you and Stacey could share a little bit about the Portal Project in the Maroon University. I know that our Imagining America community would love to hear about it. And also, as I'm listening to this conversation, I think some of what you're really planning and launching, which is quite ambitious, answers a few of Margo's questions. Where will we meet? What is the kind of learning in university we want to see? So perhaps you could share a little bit about the Portal Project and the Maroon University in response to some of the questions raised here.
Yeah. Barbara, why don't you start?
Okay. Yeah, and I'm so, happy to be partnering with Stacey in this. She's so really teaching me a lot about cooperatives and this whole realm of work that is, kind of alternatives to kind of capitalist economic models. But we envision the Portal Project of being a large number of scholars, activists, artists, engaged in conversation, debate, and collective thinking about some of the most critical questions of this moment. We're not coming together around questions and issues that we think are interesting. We're coming together around questions that we think are essential. And we're bringing people from, with different bases of knowledge, with different, who hold different reservoirs of knowledge and information together, to sort of ask the difficult questions around just transition, which is borrowed from the climate justice movement. What does it mean to transition, from one way of being and doing, from one system of power to something more liberatory? And how do you do that without having collateral damage? How do you, in the climate change world, right, in the climate justice movement, how do you move away from economies relying on coal, but understand that some people have made their livelihood and risked their lives supporting their families as coal miners? Like, what happens to them? You can't just say, yeah, you were in a messed up industry, good luck.
Right.
So how do we map getting from here to there as part of our challenge? And what we want to do is not to have that as a cushy, abstract, isolated academic chit chat, but we want to have artists in the room who help us make it graphic, who help people visualize, some of the ideas we're talking about. We'll have videographers in the room and illustrators in the room who take the exchanges that we have out into a larger community for discussion, for sharing, for debate. So that's the idea of the Portal Project. It's a 2-year project, and both Erica and I were fortunate enough to get some funding from the Marguerite Casey Foundation. And so, for me, that those resources are going to this project. We will have community fellows, as well as, academically based scholars, and then a wonderful array of artists that we're still pulling together.
Fantastic.
And Stacey has worked with a group in Boston that's doing economic justice. Well, I'll let you add anything.
Yeah, sure. I mean, across the country. So, I mean, I tend to kind of gravitate to the Center for Economic Democracy because of the work they're doing in terms of thinking about the solidarity economy and grassroots movement, and how, this idea of just transition, meaning how do you kind of infuse in the work around resistance, the resistance of oppression? How do you infuse in that some areas for self-determination and kind of economic justice, right? Because a lot of it might be resisting the oppressive kind of wage theft of firms, but some of those organizations haven't thought through, well, how do we create our own system so that people can own their own labor? How do we become, both producers of that and in a way that is both just and sustainable, right? So those are usually two different realms in terms of those that are building those worker-owned cooperatives and those that are kind of doing this resistance work. And so they're trying to bring those together. I think also those that are, so in terms of the way that we're thinking about this Portal Project and what we're hoping to do in the summer with regard to the Maroon University, it's really some of the questions that we have been unable to engage because they're big questions. These are the fundamental questions about the society we want to build, right? And that's no small task. Who should we be engaging around these big questions about democracy, about our economy as a more just and sustainable economy? So we're thinking about, like, what does that look like? How would we apply some of that on the ground, right? What is, and the way that I was thinking about it just today in conversation with folks is what I start from the question of, what do you need? What do people that are trying to do this work, what might you need from a researcher, right? So that I want my work to be informed by what they need, right? But in terms of the Maroon University, it's, how do we spend time, whether it's 6 weeks, or 8 weeks over the summer, in deep kind of thought and contemplation, and even the production of something together, right? In a way that you often don't have time, because during the school year, we're kind of busy, and those that are doing the work and the grassroots work are always busy. So how do we compensate them for their time? And it doesn't have to be in the university space, but how do we create spaces for collective learning in a way in which we can just enter the space as equals and really engage in these big questions? We haven't implemented it yet. We're hoping to start this summer, as we kind of think through who should we be engaging in this first round.
Beautiful. I'm going to take some questions because I know we only have about 10 minutes left, and we have some really great questions here. Before I do so, two of the other values that Imagining America has landed on is critical for us, and one of them is creative culture is an important site of liberation. So per your point, Barbara, of really coming together around images and sounds and music and really embodying the work is so critical. And another one is organized ideas are an important strategy for societal transformation. So I see the Portal Project and the Maroon University doing some of that work as well. I'm going to ask a couple questions together and then one later. I don't know if Judy is satisfied, but wanted to know more about the Maroon University. How's it actually going to work? What does it look like? Are there classes that are public? So a little bit more on that. And then Dr. Okazawa-Rey, someone has asked you to talk about how our jobs are a means that allow us to fulfill other world greater purposes in the world. Can the panelists describe what their work / purpose is outside of their positions as educators in the academy? So if there's any finishing kind of descriptions on the Maroon University, and then also how do you describe your work and purpose outside of your professionalized positions? I'll leave it at those two, and then we have a third.
Okay.
Yeah, Maroon University, I think as Stacey alluded to, we're still figuring it out in terms of the details. It's not going to be a public, there won't be public courses in the sense of, any curious person can join. I think we want to have a shared commitment to learning together in order to apply the knowledge in the world. And so there'll be some sort of vetting, some sort of application for people, but we also want to rid those learning spaces of hierarchies and the polluting process of grading and tuition and all that. So there'll be learning spaces. We're calling Maroon University, but really we're thinking of liberated zones that function in very different ways than traditional classrooms. But we are looking for partners. We are open. We don't want it to be exclusive. When I say it's not going to be public, I think there's so many webinars and there's so many places to just be curious, and curiosity is wonderful. But I think we're looking for a kind of higher level of commitment and reciprocity. What will students bring, as well as what will those of us organizing it share? So stay tuned, and at our website, which is SJI at UIC, I think it is. If you just Google Social Justice Initiative at UIC, you'll find our website, and there'll be some updates very, very soon. But thanks for the question, Judy. Oh, and then what is our purpose?
And then I guess
I'll let somebody else say, what is our purpose?
briefly from each of you, how do you, because we have one more question as well that's a lengthy one, how do you describe, and I suppose the question is, live your purpose outside your individual positions?
I think through my organizing, I would say through my organizing work, it's my purpose. It's, anti-capitalist, anti-racist work that I do, the feminist, feminist and anti-racist and anti-capitalist work, right? So what does that look like? It means that I use a lot of the skills that I've accrued over the years to help build a solidarity economy in different communities, right? I work with community groups and grassroots organizers to kind of fulfill the mission that they want, which is to create worker-owned cooperatives, or to engage in community planning, to establish community land trusts, anything that would be constituted as the solidarity economy, which is more than just worker cooperatives. But there are a set of frameworks and a set of legal mechanisms for doing so. And they're not always transparent. But so those of us who understand how to negotiate that system, for me, it's incumbent upon me to kind of bring that knowledge and to assist organizations that are interested in doing that. So that's one way in which I do that.
And I would say that I've known since I was age 11 that my life purpose was to be of service. And so I've tried to do that. And for me, what I do depends on the setting, right? And as I've grown older, I've been in different settings. I've done this and that. And, I don't think that's what's important. I think what's important for me has been being very, very clear that I'm here to be of service in whatever ways I can. And I think at this point in my life, I think one of the big ways that I'm trying to be of service, I'm not sure that I'm successful, is to help us deepen relationships among each other, right? and to know that when the shit hits the fan, you can bleep the S word, that what's going to carry the day is not necessarily the ideas, not necessarily the tasks, but in fact, it's how we are deeply committed to one another for the long haul, right? And that it's about deepening relationships. And I think that part of our purpose sometimes gets lost in the things we do, right? It doesn't really fit into the things we do category. So for me, it's changed over time. The particulars have changed, but the theme of being of service has not. And right now, that particular thing is to deepen relationships and to serve in whatever way I can to help make that happen.
Beautiful. Barbara, very briefly, and then we have one more question.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I hope to leave the planet a little bit better than, the mess I found it in. No, I think to be in community, in purposeful community with people, trying to make meaningful change. And I don't know. I don't know if as I've gotten older, my ambitions have gotten less, but, I do think we are in a period that is ripe for enormous change. And I'm working every day to impact that change. What I do for a job is highly secondary to that.
Right. It's a great time to be alive.
Okay, so we have two more questions that I suppose I'm going to combine them a little bit creatively, and it's our closer here that brings us back to the first question about the critical imperatives for changing higher ed today. And one individual, Monica, shares a story about a cousin who was denied tenure for critiquing male-centric narratives of the Chicano movement. And is sharing that she's lived and relived that rejection for almost 50 years. And the question really is, for those of us who exist as public scholars, how do we not lose our sense of self? How do we not be erased when those inside the structures of the academy can tell whatever truth they want to validate their decisions, or not recognizing the work that we do? And then another participant in the chat space here, Peter Matlon, asks, I would appreciate if the panelists could address power relationships and how they can be changed in the university context to move towards the vision they are presenting. And a bit more context in the chat, but perhaps take those two together. And I know we only have a couple minutes left, so consider this, maybe your call to action to change higher ed. How would you respond to these questions?
Well, I would say, some of us are building an organization called Scholars for Social Justice, so join it is one thing, as academics, we're sort of trained to function in isolation, and we have more power if we organize and if we see the collective work we can do as a far greater in terms of its potential impact than any individual project, book, research, project that we can do. And I think that those of us who are at different stages in our careers have different obligations. And, I write, it seems like hundreds of letters, but I write a lot of letters giving, trying to lend support to different ways of doing the work and different, really epistemologies in terms of scholars who are not legible to, more traditional power brokers in the academy. So I think all those things are true. We have a journal called Souls, which we invite people to publish in, which also creates a platform, and a venue for scholars to get what they need to keep the jobs they have, to do more important work than having the job.
Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. Stacey.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. I think what helped me was finding the community that will support you. Within each discipline, hopefully there's a sub strata within the discipline that you have to build relationships. The same way we're talking about building relationships with community. You find community within the institutions or within the field and build relationships there. So as Barbara mentioned, the Scholars for Social Justice is a community across, it's a national community of scholars that value and work towards social justice. Building those relationships and sustaining those relationships, it's not about being, it's not an instrumental relationship, but it becomes a space that can hold you as you move through the process.
The word that just came to my mind is humility. And when I think about humility, I think we are humble, right? Because we know that we're part of a long legacy, you know, that we have a genealogy, that we didn't just pop out of nowhere and we're smart, right? That we are part of a collective, right? That we share a common destiny, even though it doesn't look like it, right? And that we know that we're only a part of something bigger, right? And so for me, when we think about our histories, when we think about our relationships to other people, when we think about a shared destiny, the only conclusion is to be humble and to say we're part of something, right? And we're going to do what we will do our best, and that it's not about us. And part of the academic training is tricking us into thinking that it's all about us as individuals, right? As individuals. Right? And so I invite all of you all to think about this question of humility. And sometimes we think humility is we have to make ourselves smaller, right? In fact, it's quite the opposite. So think about how you work your humility, how you know when you're, you know, being humble.
Well, we are at time, and I cannot thank you three enough. I guess the call to action is be humble, build community, build long haul relationships, and write lots of letters. And more that you share throughout this hour. So Margo, Stacey, Barbara, say that again.
Join SSJ.
And join Scholars for Social Justice. And it's also put in the chat by Lisa Lee. Thank you, Lisa, for doing that. So you all have a link directly here. I can't thank you enough for joining us here. I'm so honored that you're part of our month-long engagement. And we do have more ahead. So tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 1 Central, we have Black Freedom Beyond Borders, Memories of Abolition Day, which is the project with the Wakanda Dream Lab and Policy Link and others. It will be amazing. Decolonizing Knowledge Through Art is also happening on Wednesday. Look at the schedule. And Friday, we have our closing plenary, all in the schedule for a month-long engagement at iagathering.org. So thank you all so much for joining us. You will receive the notes in the chat and the recording soon. And I believe DJ OR has a song for us too.
Yeah, come on, let's play it. Let's play it. Let's go.
Whoa.